Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Catherine, for bringing out this poster boy thing, which will probably stick with me for a long time. Well, thanks, everyone. And so here's what we're going to do. We got a fascinating topic today. It may not seem sexy at first, but it is a key element of sharing stories. It's translating. And we don't see these people. Normally, they work in the shadows. Normally, they're behind curtains. They would have been behind curtains today, but we thought, let's bring them out and let's see what they do, because there is a strong effort. Well, recently and more, we see the Council for the Arts putting out money for translation from French to English and English to French, but they also give some funding for international translations too. And Canadian authors have a very good, they are respected and they do travel a lot, but you do need translators for that. So they are, in a way, invisible, maybe not. So today, it's my pleasure to, let's say, we'll go from here to Sheila. So Laurie Saint-Martin, Paul Gagné, Neil Smith, and Sheila Fischman. So please join me today. Catherine introduced a little bit these wonderful people that I know well. I've worked with them, so on a daily basis. Sheila has recently translated Larry Tremblay's novel, which is called L'Orangerie, and it's published by Biblioasis, coming out, I think, at the end of a month. And the book has had an amazing success in Quebec, and hope it will in Canada. But there there's still some problems with translations these days, because we have great stories. We have books that sell very well in Quebec, but do not sell at all in Canada. So this is a hot topic, I would say, today. And we'll talk about the challenges of translating. I mean, is it a good thing to be a writer when you're a translator? And of course, bonjour, Sheila. Yeah. And so those are all elements, of course, and at the end, you will be able to ask any questions you have in mind for those wonderful people. So what we'll do today is, first, it's going to be easy. I'm going to ask them to kind of introduce themselves in a way. And I'm going to start actually with, go from Laurie to Sheila. Laurie, just to present yourself in a way, how did you come to be a translator, knowing that you are a writer and a professor of literature?
It wasn't planned. Can you hear? Is the mic okay? No. What do I have to do? Should I just yell? Can you hear me in the back?
No, they're not on.
No?
The mic's
Okay. What's up?
If you want, I can translate. No? Sign language.
That's a conspiracy.
His works. You tell it.
Well, try now. Is it on already?
Is it okay now? Oh, hey, big change. Thank you. It all happened because in an entirely unplanned way, I was at a book fair once, and I was looking at a display, and I came across a book called Anna Historic by a Canadian writer called Daphne Marlett. And obviously, I'd read and loved a lot of books in my life, and I just opened this one, and I started reading it just standing there, and it just seemed like a book that was saying to me, you have to translate this book. And I had never really planned to do that at all. So I talked Paul into it, and there were a lot of complications. It's a very long story, but that's the short version of how it happened, just because that book really spoke to me in that way. And then later, other things happened that led to the rest. But if that hadn't happened, I don't think we would have been down that path at all.
The thing is, they're a couple, so they have one answer. But actually, it's really
not
important.
Not always. If you're in couples,
yeah,
you know that's not always
they're
true.
They're the power couple of translating in Quebec, I can tell you that. I mean, they've translated some major heavyweight champions from Canada. So, but the thing is, I've heard, Paul, that you're the one that writes first. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
We tried many different ways of doing this. But the thing is that I was a translator doing general stuff for the government, very fascinating stuff. And at some point, I was doing both. We started doing a few books, and then publishers were nice enough to call. So I stopped working for the government, poor government. And
Never been the
now
same
I do
since.
this full time, whereas Laurie is a university professor, and she does novelist and short story writer and mother. And what she didn't say is that, what she didn't tell you is that we wanted to do something to do together beside children. So, well, now we have, we're pleased to say that we have a boy and a girl and about over 80 books between us.
Neil, you burst out on the scene with Bank Crunch as part of the new Face of Fiction program from Knopf. You won many prizes. You were and recently published a masterpiece, I shall say. No, actually, it's a very good book. It's called Boo, and it's going to come out in French. But in the meantime, you did something really interesting. You translated a book that is very special in Quebec because of the use of language, of the Quebec language,
Right.
which is called la déesse des mouches à feu, which is going to be the goddess
The
of
goddess
fireflies.
of fireflies.
Okay.
Yep.
So, how did you come to translating other people's work?
I finished Boo, and I wanted to do something between starting another novel and finishing the editing. And I've always been a translator. I've translated for the National Film Board and for Radio-Canada, the CBC, and the Planetarium, and a whole gaggle of different clients. But I hadn't done much literary translation, and I had about a 4-month break between Boo and the time it came out. So I thought I would, try my hand at literary translation. And I met Sheila at an event. She probably doesn't remember this. And I said I was thinking of doing some literary translation, and she told me to try to find an author who had not yet been translated. And this book came out, La déesse des mouches à feu. And I picked it up, and it's quite a thin book. It's 200 pages, and I thought it would be really quite easy to do. It's in the voice of a 15-year-old girl. But, and then thereafter, it took off in Quebec. It became a big bestseller. So I seem very, as if I have my finger on the pulse of Québécois literature, but it was just, it was pure luck that I picked up this book and got the rights to translate it. But translating the voice of a 15-year-old girl in 1995 who lives in Chicoutimi was not as easy as I thought it might be.
It's quite challenging, and we're going to talk about that later because you need to have a writer's voice to be a translator. You need to be invisible. And when I say that word invisible, actually, it I don't know if it's a rumor, but it might be Sheila Fischman who said that once, that translators have to be invisible. You're going to have to live with that for a long time. But, and how to introduce Sheila Fischman? Probably if you read a Quebec book, it's her translation. She translated about 150 books, starting from La Guerrière from Maura Carrier, who is attending the Kingston Writers' Fest this year. And it's a classic. So Michel Tremblay, as Catherine said, Kim Thuy, and recently Larry Tremblay. So it might be a long story, but how did you, knowing that no one was doing this, almost no one was sharing Quebec stories to go abroad, I would say abroad. It seems like there's a huge gap in between Ottawa and Gatineau, and there's another country, what they call the Rock, the rest of Canada. But actually there is. So what was the atmosphere at that time, and what brought you to be kind of a pioneer in that field?
I didn't think of being a pioneer. I didn't think that I was going to become a translator, although I did one for my own pleasure. I didn't know what to do with it. I had recently moved to Quebec from Toronto, and my first goal was to learn to speak French and to read it, and it didn't go beyond that. Someone suggested I try translating something and gave me a copy of Anne Hébert's classic short story, Le Torrent, and I couldn't translate it. I couldn't even read it. That was, the extent of my bilingualism at the time. So then I met this young writer who had published one book, and his wife told me that it has easy words in it. excuse me, I'm sure it would be an interesting exercise for you. And so I sat down and I started to translate it, and it was fun. And I was learning things that I didn't know before. And what I really was marked by was the fact that I just love working with words. I'm not a writer myself. I could never create a character or a story for that matter. I just like taking the words from the other language and putting the language into mine. And for the first book to be like Sir, kind of interesting because it for those few of you who haven't read it, it's set in a small village in the eastern townships of Quebec, and there's a lot of tension, anger, and even violence around the fact that the village is roughly half Francophone and half Anglophone, and bad things happen. I won't tell you the details. You'll have to read it. And while I was translating this book, I kept thinking back to the village where I grew up, really. And although the tensions were not nearly as forceful as they were in La Guerre, there was still, at a certain level, some mutual distrust, mutual lack of knowledge even, I can say. So it just seemed to flow from my pen. And when I realized that it was a really good novel, I started knocking doors of publishers. And eventually I learned that a new publishing house called House of Anansi had just been created in somebody's basement. And they took this book, and the rest was, well, it continued. It continued. I love the idea of Anansi starting in a basement, and I think, I've never been there, but I imagine it's at least a penthouse, and God knows what more.
Well, I can
in
assure
Toronto.
you, they all start in basements, except probably Random House of Canada. But they all start in
Yeah,
basements
right.
or in lockers, or it all starts small and getting big and big. I'm getting back to you on. You said it flew or it flowed. Sorry, from your pen. Did you ever have a very tough translation to do? Like you kind of hit a wall and said, like, this one I can't do?
But in La Guerre, oh God, yes.
Or over all these books, over all these years of translating, was there one very difficult book to translate?
Oh, there were quite a few difficult books. Most recently, I would say Griffintown by Marie-Hélène Poitras. It's set in a segment of Montreal that used to contain a stable, a good-sized stable, where were housed the horses that draw the calèche in part of Montreal that really is called Griffintown. And so I read this book, and I thought it was really terrific, and I thought it would have a wide appeal because it's not political, it's not social either, really. Anyway, so I told a publisher about it and said I would love to translate it if he wanted to take it on, and he said sure. And then I sat down, not with a pencil, with my computer, and it was one of the most difficult books to translate that I have ever encountered. And I've translated Gaëtan Soucy's novel La Petite Fille qui aimait trop les animates, and a few others that were pretty difficult. But it was this seemingly straightforward novel that had been very well reviewed, and with reason, but oh boy, under the surface, under the words, there is a difficult syntax, which gave me no end of problems. I would sit sometimes for a couple of days before I got a paragraph, not just translated, but puzzled out. I had to know exactly what she was doing with these words to create the effect that she did. And I finally turned into the publisher, having taken about twice as long as I expected. And it'll be coming out later this year, I think. And it was a challenge. Challenges are good, but it was really, really hard. I think that's the only one that gave me such dramatic load of trouble.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that because I can assure you I try to do my best in French on that one, but I never thought it would be that difficult. So well, thank you
It
for
can be.
taking the time to translate that. I'm getting back on the French side of things now, to getting back to Laurie and Paul. You've been part of this translating industry, and you've been recognized by the Council for the Arts many times. And so you have seen, do you want a glass of water? You have seen authors recognized, sometimes not recognized, and you've translated, like I said, major voices in Canada. What would be today, and it's kind of a big question, but we can narrow it down to a few key factors, but what would be the state of the English-Canadian literature as seen from Quebec? Because it has evolved in the last few years, and you brought up some very major names, and normally what we have in Quebec is translations that come from France, and they kind of fly over our heads and come back to us like a month later. But more and more now we have Quebec translators, which are wonderful translators. Honestly, I think the best French to English to French translators. And it's not to send you flowers, but we do know better. I'm sorry. So we have good translators here. From your experience, what might be the state of the English-Canadian literature as seen from Quebec?
When I first started talking with my colleagues at the university about the fact that we were going to be translating some English-Canadian authors, one of my colleagues said, "Why would you want to do that? It's so boring. English-Canadian literature is really boring." And I said, "Oh, really? What did you read that you didn't like?" And he said, "I don't have to read that stuff. I know it's boring." So that was a little over 20 years ago. So I think that a lot of people, that has changed a lot, fortunately, and many very well-known and not so well-known, but deserving to be well-known English-Canadian writers are translated in Quebec. And like Antoine, we think that is better just because we know what life is like here. We know what they mean when they make cultural references or when they talk about institutions that we have here or characters that we have here and that they don't know about in France, and they don't really always care about finding out. Sometimes they'll just make something up and they'll, that's good enough, or they'll put down a reference. When it's hockey, they'll use soccer vocabulary, and that's good enough. So we think that Canadian translators will not do that, and that's one of the things I think that we as a group bring to the work.
Yeah, well, on that topic, we have to say a word about a big project we're working on now. It's retranslating Mordecai Rickler's novels, at least 5 of them. That one came out last spring, one will come out this fall, and 3 more to go for sure, and we hope 4 more. And to us, it's important because, we were afraid. Mordecai Rickler is not the most popular writer in Quebec. If you talk to a French reader, he's not their favorite guy. Some people even said, "I don't care, retranslate it, do what you want, I ain't reading it." So we've seen a lot of that but to us it's important, and just to make a long story quite short, it's important to me for us to show that Mordecai Rickler was a Quebec writer, and I don't think he was always well served by his previous translators, especially the French ones. Not because they're no good, because they didn't know as well as we do, I hope, Quebec context. So that's just one example.
I have an
Of course,
interesting example too for that.
Yeah.
As they said, when the books are translated here in North America from English to French, the francophones know the cultural references. And I read one of Donna Tartt's novels, and it was translated in France, and it takes place in New England. And there's a chain of convenience stores called Cumberland Farms, which my father would know because we lived there. And the translator simply thought, the French translator in France thought it was an actual farm. So whenever they went to go get milk or something from the corner store, from the convenience store, in the translation they went all the way to a farm to pick things up. And I think that here had the translation been done by these two, stuff like that would never happen. And that happens a lot when you read, and even there are English Quebecers whose novels are translated in France, and even though the action might take place in Montreal, suddenly all the characters start speaking with Parisian accents, and when those books come out in Quebec, they're just trashed, and no one wants to read them because they don't sound at all authentic. And that's why certain writers here want necessarily to have their works translated by Québécois translators to avoid any problems like that.
And if I can just maybe say one more thing on this topic. When we first started, it wasn't the case, but now you will often see, Antoine knows a lot about this, Quebec publishers now working with French publishers, and sometimes the translation is done on the other side of the ocean, but oftentimes now you will see translations by a number of Quebec translators appearing with French publishers, and sometimes they'll change a few words just because there are different local ways of saying things, but really it's basically our translations, ours as a number of Quebec translators are now being read in France, and that's something that you didn't see in the past, and I think that's a sign of greater respect for the work that's being done here on the other side of the ocean. And that really serves authors well, because obviously France is a big market. It's a much bigger market than Quebec, and they want to be there, and rightly so. But if they're there with the translation that was done, as Neil said, and we've always tried to advocate for, by somebody who knows the context, then it's doubly good for authors.
We've even
And
done
you're
we've
right
even
to
done a couple
point that.
directly for France. We were quite proud of that, not because but it was not. It was hard for France to ask us to work directly for them, and we've done that a few times, and we're quite happy and proud of that. That's
Well, we could go on with some major horror stories about France and Quebec, I can tell you that. And we personally had few episodes on this. But you're right to point out that more and more there are translations being made in Quebec, and they are recognized. For example, Rawiyage had De Niro's Game, which won the Impact Dublin Award. Well, it was published by De Noël with Sophie Voileau, who established she won, I think, 3 GGs, and her translations are published by De Noël, and they're really happy with it. They didn't really change things. Getting back to Mordecai Richler, there was actually that thing with the hockey game in Barney's version. So that was the infamous hockey game, of course. And so this is a French thing, though. But let's get into politics now. You said political, Sheila, and did things ever get too political in that field? Or was it because we say 2 solitudes, we say we don't really care about the neighbor and blah, 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 and I don't want to rip this audience, with tears and, start a whole fight here. But it's been tough to get Quebec writers recognized, and it's been tough to bring Canadian authors to Quebec readers. So,
Yeah, I can remember one episode that I suspect everybody here knows something about. It was the time when a chapter or 2 of Richler spoke about Canada and Quebec, whither the country and so forth. It was published in the New Yorker before the expanded book was published. And it was believed that he was saying things that were extremely hurtful and ugly to and about Francophone Quebecers. And there was a hue and cry like you can't believe. And as people started talking about him, people who would never have probably heard of Mordecai Richler before, but they knew that he had written this piece in an American magazine, not quite true, and that he had dared to insult le Québécois, though he'd lived here a good part of his life. When asked if they had read it, I'm thinking of 4 or 5 people I talked to. A couple were academics and the others were writers of some kind. And I asked timidly if they had read it. I don't need to read it, it's ugly. Get it away from me, which is something like the reaction that you've had. But my God, these were important intellectuals. I'm going to name one, he's dead now. Well, yeah, he is. I can't help it. His name was Pierre Vadeboncoeur, and he wrote essays about philosophy, culture, and politics. He was a really fine writer and a good man, but he didn't have to read Richler because Richler's work had all come into his brain through some kind of waves. It was very upsetting, I can tell you.
Neil, you are right in the middle of things. Well, geographically here today, but you are established in Montreal. You're an Anglophone writer. You do speak perfectly well French. You do live in both in French and English. What's your point of view on all this, like stuck in between all this in Montreal?
I've never had problems with it, really. I started speaking French when I was a teenager. I lived in Quebec City and was surrounded by Francophones who didn't speak any English, and I had to pick it up very quickly. And I've lived in French since that time, really. At home, the language we speak at home is French. So I don't have this sort of animosity, or I've never had any bitter stories to tell. I love Montreal and I love living in both languages. The political situation can weigh upon us at times, but I think in the end we start looking away or living outside the perpetual crises that seem to arrive in Quebec, and enjoy other aspects of Montreal and Quebec.
Because sometimes when I got asked why I do translations and people tend to go into politics, we're not into politics, we're into words or into fiction.
No,
we're into
my book
telling
is about an imaginary heaven where 13-year-olds go when they die. It's not a political
That's
story.
That's not very political. That's good.
It's not even set in Montreal. It's set in, but when I started translating the novel La déesse des mouches à feu, I had to come to grips with more, not political problems, but more linguistic problems. How the language has evolved in Quebec and in specific regions of Quebec. The language in this novel is set in Chicoutimi. It uses words that no one in Montreal knows. And I think one of the reasons the book became so popular is because people read this book and discovered another type of language that they might have heard a few words of but didn't really know. So it was like a foreign language for them too. So it made the translation very difficult to do. The different pockets of French around throughout the province can be quite difficult. I'm sure Sheila has come across this problem in books that she's translated. What do you do with this type of language? It exists, I guess, in Canada, English Canada, somewhat, but not to the same extent. I would think maybe of Newfoundland and certain Newfoundland expressions that we don't use commonly. But the French experience in Quebec, it's you know, the proximity is there. These communities are fairly close together, yet the language can be quite different depending on the community.
This was not prepared, but what about swearing?
Yes, this is the.
It's
the most fun.
I mean, we do have a lot of, you know, we have a colorful language, and it seems, that's my point of view, you have less options in English.
Right.
So, and
one of
you've seen that. So, what do you do with this down-to-earth talk?
One of the examples from the Déesse des Mouchafeuses, the 15-year-old girl finds her boyfriend sleeping with another girl, and she calls her in French, une chienne à bite. And literally,
Let's not translate that.
that chienne is the. I'm not sure if you all speak any French. Chienne is the female version of chien, dog. So it would be like bitch, and bit is the dick, I guess. So it's like dick bitch, but we don't say that in English. So what do we say? What would a 15-year-old call another girl who slept with her boyfriend in 1995? So I had to go and ask women who would have been 15 at that time. I had a woman go through her journal looking for the worst insults that she called other girls. So we came up with two possibilities, cunt face and slut bucket. And I ended up using them both in the novel. So swearing is a nightmare. Luckily, in her book, she didn't use any of the typical Québécois swears like tabarnak, calice, esti. She didn't use those. She's used very specific teenage slang stuff. But even that, esti, tabarnak, calice, is a nightmare to translate.
We have the it's a different problem. We have that F word. We meet this in almost every book we do. And how do you do it? If you do it for Quebec, then you have to take your pick. There's a whole bunch of them. But if it's going to be read in France, then it does not work anymore. So it's a huge problem. I know it sounds trivial, but it's not.
And it came up even in my book that you translated.
Unfortunately,
yeah.
No, and sometimes I've read somewhere that the best way of translating a swear word is not to translate it. Don't know if it's true, but sometimes we have. Otherwise, it's either to French or to Quebec. So we aim for Greenland.
It's harder to hit than you might think.
Yeah, it's not easy.
It is tricky. For example, in the Richler novels, they swear a lot. And many of the Jewish characters still like to say, they say Christ Almighty, or they say for the love of Christ. And so when we went to the publisher with our final manuscript, they said, do you really want them to say that? That's kind of weird. Well, it's not really any weirder than it was in English. That's what they say. So the word Jesus or Christ has to be in the swear words that are in the French translation as well, because he's saying something with that. It's not just profanity. And one of the things that you have to try and pick up is what the swearing is about.
The intent.
Yeah, the intent. Sometimes it's just, my character's angry. And sometimes it means a lot more than that, because sometimes the words will carry other meanings than that. So it's one of the things. If you would say, let's make a quick list of the tricky issues involved in translating both for Quebec and France at the same time, that's definitely in the top 3, if not number 1.
That and blueberry.
Yeah, that and the word blueberry, because in Quebec it's bleuet, and in France a bleuet is a bluebell, a flower. So they say, oh, they eat bluebell pie in Quebec. They're so stupid, ha, ha, ha. So there's no middle ground. It's one or the other. So what's really the easiest is for us to do it with the bleuet here, and then the French publisher will say, well, we'll just change a few words here and there with the most, they put down myrtille, which is the way they said. And if you had that in a translation done here, you'd never hear the end of it. But if you have bleuet or in France, you never hear the end of that. So they're just, sometimes you can't compromise.
They actually asked me never to use the word blueberry in my
we
books.
have
They told me to use
forbidden those.
raspberry instead. It's easier.
We had the honor
So my
of
characters will
translating
never eat blueberry pie.
And we're working hard on educating all of our writers.
We're trying.
We try. Neil's a nice guy. He said he wouldn't use it anymore.
I would just like to state publicly that I am guilty of not translating curse words. In my very first novel, Gagné, as you all know, the book was littered with words that were oaths, although I didn't know that the first time around. When I did the first draft, I knew nothing about Quebec swearing. And so I tentatively put in the exact English equivalents. Host, tabernacle. And then at a certain point, I explained to Rock Carrier that I was having a terrible time with these religious words that I don't know where they're coming from. And he told me. So then I could continue trying to do word-for-word translations of these expressions, which was stupid. That wouldn't work. It was suggested that I try putting it into Newfoundland English, which would have been a lie. And on and on. There is something that I do sometimes if it's appropriate and discreet enough, and that is to provide what I call an internal footnote, whereby there will be one of these untranslatable curse expressions, and I will, very delicate on tiptoe, say what that word means. But the reader's eye isn't distracted by having to go to the bottom of the page. Anyway, getting back to my cowardice, I decided not to translate the curses at all. Now and then there might be a faint possibility of using a French term, but that didn't happen very often. And so Gagné is peppered with French words in the English version. I don't apologize for doing that. I didn't at the time. I don't now. And it has, this kind of translation-ese has made its way into the English language in Canada at any rate. A very, well, I wasn't going to say this, but I think that Margaret Lawrence, the late Margaret Lawrence, is only one of a number of Canadian writers who have Francophone characters who use the odd French term. In The Diviners, I think there's a character who is a métis, and not in every sentence, but now and then when he's talking and he's mad, he will toss off a hostie or something equivalent. But yeah, if I had my way, that kind of swearing would be eliminated from the French language, and along with a few words that are pretty damn hard too. Anyway, cursing, yes, it plays an interesting role, and long may it go on.
Not sure. Remember, people, that these wonderful translators gathered here can actually win a GG, and even if they use the word cunt bucket, you know? So I do wish you good luck for next year's prize, though, on that one, because it's colorful,
I'll be sure
though.
to use it in my acceptance speech. I actually did a workshop recently with high school students on swearing and how swear words have evolved over the years and what might be acceptable to them that wasn't acceptable to their parents, what your older brother and sister might use, and of course they loved it. They could say any word in class. One of the teachers, though, was 25 years old, and she was mortified. She sat like this at her desk, would barely look up while I was saying cunt face and other very colorful words. But they loved it, and we talked about things like, not to monopolize the conversation about swearing, but we talked about how words like bitch have changed over the years and how they use it nowadays just to mean stupid, and even the boys call each other bitches now, and things like that. And when you're writing, you have to consider the age group, the period that you're talking about, to make sure that, because if you get those things wrong, particularly in a book for younger people, they'll pick up on it and they'll know that it's artificial.
Well, you're right to say that. Did you want to add something, Sheila? Yeah, so do you...
No, it's okay. It was
Okay.
taken care of.
Let's get technical now. Let's go away from swearing. But it was a good thing we went on swearing, because you have to stay true to the author's voice.
Right.
And you don't have to... I'm not even sure I can say that in English. Transvestite, is that an English word at all? Like travestir? I'm asking translators here.
I don't think
Go.
you'd use
It's not a verb.
Travestir quelque chose, or change the voice, or to what is trahir?
Betray.
Betray. Thank you. Okay, wow, translators. That's useful.
Simultaneous, all three of
I
us
like
betray.
this. I like this. Okay, now and that's another one. We'll go on the fast question. No, actually, you don't want to betray. I love that
Right.
word. So what makes? And I'll start with Laurie. I like it when you interview people, French people in English, and you say their names like Laurie and Paul.
And
So
Antoine.
Laurie, yeah, go. Thank you, Neil. So
That's how we
what
picked
makes
our
a good
kids' names.
translator?
They
Laurie?
had to be able to be. You got to be able to use them in both. I think you have to find the voice. The people say this about writing, but it's true about translating too. You have to follow the voice or the voices that are in the book, and you have to go where they go. You have to find sometimes really different ways of doing the same thing. And sometimes you'll hear people saying, well, you have to do everything in exactly the same way as it is in the original. And you almost have to follow the same word order. And they'll look at a passage, and if there were 16 commas in the English and you have 17 or 15, there's something wrong with the translation. And sometimes I'm not an advocate of changing it all and moving it around and rewriting it for the sake of it at all. But sometimes you have to change something for it to be the same for the reader in the other language. The reader is not looking back to the original and counting the commas. The reader is trusting you to give you the voice of that author. And that's how you don't betray it, I think. That's how you show that you are willing to bear that trust.
Because English and French are very different material. We feel sometimes as Canadians that it's very similar because we live with each other. But when you work from, in our case, English to French, you realize how completely different it is. I'm not a Spanish speaker, but when I hear Spanish, sometimes I feel it almost as if it were French. With English, it's never the case.
In La déesse des Mouchafeurs, the 15-year-old narrator makes a lot of grammar mistakes, and the verbs are not always conjugated correctly. And we don't make the same type of grammar mistakes in English. So I had to make variations. And I'll give you an example. She says that she and her mother both have dyed hair. And for dyed hair, she says des cheveux tendus. Tendu is, as a grammar mistake, it should be teint for dyed hair. In English, we don't make a mistake with dyed hair, so I had to find another way. So I would say something like, me and my mom have dyed hair. Me and instead of my mother and I. So you sometimes have to adjust where the mistakes are. It doesn't have to be that word. It can be elsewhere in the paragraph or even elsewhere in the book. And I think that Laurie and Paul did that with my book sometimes. They might not have used a play on words where I used it, but they would use another one, a really excellent one, elsewhere on the page or elsewhere in the chapter. Yes, you do that one.
Yeah.
You tell that one.
Yeah, go for it.
It was the caravan, right?
It was, what was it called? In the
caravan, I think, in
Caravan?
English.
right, it's the main character has a pet roach, and he carries it around in a margarine container, and he calls it
The caravan, I think.
the caravan?
Yeah. And well, it occurred to me not the first time, not the third time, but I guess the fourth time around, I said Blatmobile. And that was, I was,
Because Blat
Blat
is
means
the name of
cockroach.
it.
I was pretty proud
Blat
of this
is the
one.
name of the bug, right? so-
This one, I'm still happy about it.
So sometimes you have just a moment of serendipity like that,
Yeah, it's,
and it feels good.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Just for the fun of it, translate serendipity.
Oh no way!
That's a
That was
tough-
in
that's a
Neil.
tough one.
That was in Neil's book, and you always have to paraphrase that when you have to go around. There's not a really good word for it, and that happens.
Yep.
You know, sometimes there just really
they're
isn't
different.
a good word to say that very thing. And English sometimes is pithier. If you say like
Precise or
pocket dial,
concise.
right, or purse dial or something like that, and you can just take two words and you put them together and they become a compound. And if you said that in French, you'd have to use a number of. It would be a lot
Phrases.
longer. Yeah, you'd have to make a long phrase. You'd say, by mistake, I press the button in my purse or something like that. But in another case, French might be shorter and more concise. And when you're translating back the other way, you
Right.
might have to kind of unpack it and explain it. Every
Right.
language has its own density and its own texture.
Very true.
Sheila, what makes a good translator?
A good translator. It's easier to talk about what makes a good translation, but I'll give it a go. A good translator has to have a really good ear, because to translate a novel, because that's what I know about, you have to know the original text intimately. You have to be able to absorb it through your ears. And to silence any sort of voice of your own, so that there's no danger of some of your own writing style leaking into the translation. So yeah, that's the first thing you look for in a good translator. I say invisible too, but that's not so important as silencing the voice. I think a translator has to be patient. A translator has to be humble. Must not go around saying or thinking, this is a text that gains in the translation or that loses in the original. I'm sure we've all encountered those. A translator has to have a good judgment too, in order to determine just how close to the original this phrase has to be. This, of course, assumes that the translator has a terrific command of his own language, a wonderful command of his own language, not just the grammar, not just the fancy words, but the almost organic, living sense of the original word. Has to be patient, I guess. Yeah, definitely has to be patient, because if you are sitting in front of a text and there is one sentence or even one paragraph that is causing you trouble, there might be a temptation to simplify it, to shorten it, or simplify it. Can't do that either. If it's difficult in French, it's going to be difficult in English, depending on the reason for the difficulty, obviously. If it's difficult because there are a lot of technical words, well, that's not such a big problem, because you can go to your dictionaries, of course, and good old Wikipedia, and most important, your author, who can explain why this word was chosen, although it's more difficult. I think these are all negative characteristics that I've been giving you, except that ideally we hope that translators will be not just writers, but good writers. of their translations.
So you said writers. You said to have a voice of your own, to be humble, to be in command of your own language, which brings me to this again a big question, and we see that more and more now in the Canadian and Quebec literature, or Canadian literature at all. I mean, in general, is it a good thing or a bad thing to be a writer? Because Laurie, we talked about this yesterday, and more writers now are translators. That could be commercially, that could be very good because you have a name that is well known, conveying or translating and sharing an author's voice. That could lead more readers to take that book. Neil, you are a writer. Laurie, you are a writer. So, starting with Laurie, is that a good thing, a bad thing? Could it lead to some personal ways of going around the original voice?
Anything and everything can happen. There are all kinds of writers. I think if you are a writer and a translator, it can be a wonderful thing. It can be a wonderful experience for a writer to translate, because I think you learn something about your own language as well as about the other one, because you're doing different things with it. You're bending it in different ways. I've written fiction. I grew up in Kitchener, down the 4-1 a bit, and I've lived in Montreal for a long time now, and I've written 3 books of short fiction and a novel, all in French. And actually the English translation by Peter McCambridge of the novel is just coming out pretty much as we speak. So that's quite exciting, and I also got to work with him. He's a newer and really, really good translator. But it depends. You have to think when you're translating. When I was listening to Sheila, I thought of another attribute of a good translator. You have to really care. You have to really care, and you have to take the time, and you have to treat every little detail. There are no details. It's all important. There is nothing minor. It's all important. And when you're reading a book, just as a reader for pleasure, you can skip over, a long, obscure passage, or if there's a reference you don't understand, you can just forget about it. When you're translating, you have to work that through. And I've done just a little bit as well of self-translation. I've translated into English of a few short pieces that I've written. And that allowed me to see very clearly what the difference between translating yourself is and translating somebody else. Because I can change everything. The translations that I've done of myself are things that I would never condone in anybody who is translating me. I would never translate anyone else like that. It's a different exercise. You have all the freedom. When you're an author, it's all about you, or it's all about your characters, it's all about the story you're telling, but only you can do it. When you're a translator, you are starting with something that someone else has entrusted you with. And if you wrote it, then you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to deal with any pesky author and what they might say, right? Because you're the author again. So a translator is somewhere in between somebody who just puts it through some kind of grinder and brings it out in another language, and a writer in the fullest sense of the term. But there's definitely a creative component in literary translation. So I think some writers will use that to be better translators. And I once tried an experiment with an author who I will not name because this author is alive. And this person tried to translate something that I had written, and it just sounded like the way that person writes and not at all the way I wrote. And that's not translation. So you have to forget, or if you're a translator, you can never forget that it's not about you. It's about the book and the voice. It's not really about the author even. It's about the book and the voice, or the voices in the book.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. I highly recommend to any writers who speak both languages to try translation. And I met Lawrence Hill at the festival, and I was trying to encourage him to do it. He speaks French beautifully. And I think you really learn about the structure of language more so when you speak 2 languages, and when you study both languages, and when you try to translate into another language. You have a better idea of syntax and grammar, and so I encourage anyone to do it. And I like what Sheila said earlier. It's also a question of musicality. When you read these pieces, I often read aloud whether I'm writing fiction or translating, and you can hear where the wrong notes are, I find. And you have to develop that ear. Maybe not everyone has that ear either, but as a writer, you tend to have it anyway for your own work, and you have to develop it with another piece of writing that you're translating. With Geneviève Peterson's work, I had to become a 15-year-old girl in 1995, and I had to remember that to be truthful to her voice, what she would say, not what I would have said while I was that age in another era, what she would be saying at that particular time based on the type of person she was. And that's what I love about writing anyway, becoming other people, putting yourself in other people's shoes and becoming these characters. So with translation, it's someone else who has created this character, but for me, it was just as fun to translate. And also it took a lot of pressure off. I didn't have to worry so much about, will this sell? Will my editor like it? How many copies will I sell? It freed me up a bit. And I found it just a marvelous experience that I want to try again. And I'm in a little bit of a privileged position because as a writer, I can pick and choose somewhat. And these people certainly can do the same thing because they've built such a reputation for themselves. But when you're first starting out as a translator, you don't often get the chance to call up a publisher and say, look, I found this book, I want to translate it, and they say yes right away. With me, it was because I had already published a couple of books, the publisher said yes right away, and that never happens in the publishing world. Everything takes so long.
You said words that are very important, actually. Will it sell? And that brings me to the commercial side of things, because it is very important. We've seen recently Quebec writers, for example, this year, Samuel Archibald is on the long list for the Giller. Kim Thuy was on a short list, was it 2 years ago, I think. Pascal Kivigé was on a short list. So there were 5, I think, Quebec writers on the short list of the Giller, which is a very good, huge thing for us in Quebec. Whenever one of our Quebec writers goes on that list, we all go berserk or something. And so things have changed. But I got some numbers from the Council for the Arts. Thank you for them. They actually sent me statistics. In 2014-2015, there were 125 grant submissions at the Council for the Arts. Blah, blah, blah. This, then 20 publishers, English publishers, have asked for 53 grants. 30 Francophone publishers have asked for 72 grants. And the average tirage is print run would be in between. And we never talk about print run. It's kind of a taboo thing. But it is tough. And it goes from 350 to 6,000 copies. So, and this was, in 2013-2014, it was 41 in French, and it was 66 in English. And I think it was around the same 2010-2011. It was 107 in, no, that was the total, 41.73. So it's changed a little bit. And just to point out that they now organize every year, I think, Catherine, am I right, 4 or 5 years, I think now, one day of love and sharing of words and, English, Canadian literature, embracing Quebec literature. And we do that at your place, at my place. We do that in Toronto or in Montreal. And there were a very, very good things came out of that. A lot of translations now came out of this, and some of them have had good success. But to be really honest, and I'm not pointing out my work or any of my colleagues' works, but it is very tough to have a Quebec book to have a success in English Canada. And the other way around, we have major English Canadian writers not even recognized in Quebec. And we talked earlier about translations made in Quebec, not even traveling to France. I saw Diane Chamberlain's name on the back here. Forms of Devotion was published in 1998. When I picked up that book, it was a wonderful book, and I said, okay, well, let's go ahead, and we'll have a success with that. It's not even published in France. And it won a GG for fiction, I think, that's it, 1998. Which brings me to, from your point of view, and I'd like to hear each of you on that, what is, you see a bright future? You see things changing? Are we opening up? Because the market is difficult right now. So despite the state of the market, will things get better for translated fiction?
I'm an optimist, so I think so. It's a really complicated issue. Sometimes writers will say to us, "Oh, my translator made a lot more money on my book than I did," and it can happen if it's a big fat book that didn't sell a lot of copies in the original. The Canada Council pays the translator per word, so the bigger the book, the longer it takes, but the more you make. But if you write a longer book, you don't necessarily make more money. It depends how many copies it sells, how copies it'll sell. So sometimes there's a bit of a kind of an odd look at a translator by the author. So I'm thinking, well, yeah, well, what about that? But on the other hand, translators are not usually recognized. One of the issues that we sometimes talk about is whether the translator's name appears on the front cover. Usually not. Usually it appears on the inside, sometimes on the back cover, whereas the author's name always is obviously very, very large. So that's a matter of recognition. Often books are reviewed and the translator's not even mentioned. So that's kind of strange. Then there are all kinds of, power plays almost, I would say, or imbalances of that kind. So it's difficult. It's kind of a fraught relationship, and at the same time, it's a necessary and a wonderful one. So I think though that really, I'm optimistic. I think that sometimes things happen that are miraculous, but it's hard. It's hard to sell books. It's hard to sell books in the original language. It's hard to sell books in translation, but great books sometimes do make their way and get the recognition they deserve, sometimes through translation.
Paul?
Well, just point out that the third book we translated, Anne-Marie MacDonald's Fall on Your Knees, which won the GG in 2000, sold, I think it's over 40,000 copies in Quebec, and almost as many in France, I think. So, I mean, it's possible. It's we're the new Anne-Marie MacDonald's novel is coming out now. We're hoping. Is it going to do as well? We'll see. We're hoping. We're confident.
I like confident and optimistic people, by the way. I like this.
Thank you, Antoine.
It's also it's different on the English side. In English Canada, when you come out with a book and you meet with your agent and with your publisher, there's the concern of whether it's going to sell in the US and the UK. I mean, that's what they really want. And with Boo, it was sold in all three countries. And when I did the translation of La déesse des mouches à feu into Fireflies, Goddess of Fireflies, the publisher too said that he was aiming for the US, to the point that he wanted me to use American spellings, and he wanted some of the names changed so that it would be easier for Americans to recognize these names. So on that side, we have it a little easier. Not a lot easier, but a little easier. The Francophones that I know, the Francophone writers in Montreal, it's tough for them to get published in France. It's really, really tough for them to get a contract. I think tougher than for me to get a contract in the UK and the US. So I can't complain too much, but I'm hoping that... I find that a lot of Québécois writers are starting to write outside of Quebec as well. Their stories are a little more universal maybe than they used to be, and that should help as well. I mean, you're the expert. A lot of your authors are being published in France, and you've had some
Things
success
have changed,
there.
yeah.
L'Orangerie, which Sheila just translated as the Orange Grove, that's been spectacularly successful around the world. How many languages so
we sold
far?
it to 9 countries so far.
9 countries.
And it's got to do with bombings and,
It's set in an
blowing yourself
imaginary
up.
world.
And we sold it to Israel. I was kind of surprised.
Really?
So, yeah, I mean, so it traveled.
But it's like the Boo as well. It's because it's set in a fantastic world. It was easier to sell, and we sold it to 10 publishers. So those types of books seem to travel well. Something that maybe is set in Quebec and talks about Quebec concerns, less so, I imagine.
Well, you're definitely sorry. You're right on that one because, and we may not be able today to express on that, but or to reflect on that. Sorry, but our stories now are more and more international. We tend to say, you said English Canadian literature, is it boring? Is it the story from a woman dying from cancer in a little town in the prairie, or it's always, it's all cliche. I like to use French words in English conversations. It's a tour de force. So I don't know. The thing is, Quebec literature has changed, and Before we go on to questions, Sheila, I'd like you to close this conversation on translation on your thoughts about the future of translated fiction.
I'm very optimistic about the future, about what a future, excuse me, francophone, French language literature translated into English is going to have better and larger and larger reputation. This is ironic, but it's the ongoing presence of the Canada Council for the Arts in our world that will guarantee such activity. I think, especially if one candidate for the upcoming election promised to double the Canada Council budget when he's elected. And I think that's wonderful.
Who promised that? Who promised that?
Excuse me. It's. I'm optimistic because there is simply a growing interest in a certain kind of fiction, and this doesn't make sense, I suppose, but with the advent of the Kindle and the iPad, with on which you can read books from all over the world, I think people feel that their appetite for books, for works of translation, there's no limit. You know, you can, at the flick of a switch, read something from Finnish translated into Spanish, and just a whole range of products of translation, I guess I would say. Also, we travel more. We travel to more and more places that are different from the place where we are. And that creates appetites too that people want to be able to fix. Writers themselves seem to be more and more interested in meeting their readership, if I can say so. And there are more and more venues where this can happen, in addition to tours and readings as part of the tour. Excuse me, again, the Canada Council for the Arts is making that possible by giving out a stipend, which is not going to give them the kind of royalties that some of our authors do, but will be on the way. I'm not sounding very enthusiastic because I have a dry throat, but trust me, I'm very excited and optimistic about the future of our work and your work in particular, I must say, because obviously without a publisher, it doesn't exist.
Well, we're on
Right.
this. We're in this thing together, and it's kind of
Yeah,
fun too.
it's-
As you can see, I told you it was going to be fun. Any questions? Thank you, Sheila. Any questions from the audience? Again, yep.
No,
Right
whatever. Say.
Did I see a hand raised? You wait for the microphone here, and it's coming.
Yeah, I want to.
It's not a particularly high-level question. It's just that when I buy, I think they're European frozen blueberries at the local metro. They're called Bleuets Sauvage. So is that?
The label was probably printed here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
because when you buy things, they have English and French labels because that's an import requirement.
Yeah.
But it's a good point. It's a way sometimes that's a way to learn words. The first time that I saw French growing up in Kitchener was on cereal boxes. And they were on the table, and I was always looking for something to do to pretend I wasn't there. And that's how I started reading the labels on Cheese Whiz and on cereal boxes and so on.
Yeah.
And it was a whole new world.
I
But
have
they
a-
wouldn't use that in France.
No. No, they would not.
Even recently in Montreal, there are more and more French people moving from France to Montreal. And I was at my local grocery store the other day, and I was looking for the limes. And in Quebec, you say lime. And I asked for the lime, and the kid who worked there, who was probably about 16, said, "On dit pas lime, on dit citron vert." In this really Parisian accent, he was correcting my French. In Quebec, we don't say citron vert, which means literally green lemon. So I wonder at one point whether the French from France, because there are so many French people moving to Montreal, whether it'll start infecting the language
They're going to
somewhat.
take over.
Yeah.
Well,
C'est
when
citron
you
vert.
know that you're right, you have no doubt.
I
That's
could have
the
killed
thing,
him.
They will tell you.
They'll tell you.
I could have pummeled him with
They will tell you.
both limes and lemons.
There are a whole bunch of jokes about French people in Quebec, but I won't tell any.
No, it will happen. It will be more and more present in the native French language, as long as the words in French are no more than 40% the size of the Quebec.
All right.
The Quebec
But I wonder
French.
whether people in Quebec will ever start saying things like vachement. Because I live in Outremont, and all the kids are saying that because they're all from France now. And will the Québécois start saying things like that too?
Well, if
This is
people
off
from Canada
topic,
start
sorry.
to say a je ne sais quoi, well, it's, it goes both ways. So.
But that's how languages live and change and evolve. That's just the things that happen. And it's not bad, it's not good. It's just the way
It's-
it is.
it's
I think
interesting.
it's the life of language because it's spoken by living people and
Right.
it keeps changing.
Another question? Yes?
Which French publisher is reissuing and retranslating the works of Mordechai Richler?
It's Boreal. It's a Montreal publisher. It's a
And
very brave thing they're doing.
It's a brave
Thanks
thing.
to the,
it's a brave
uh,
thing. Thanks to the
Thanks to
Canada
the
Council.
Canada Council.
But it's true.
I would say the publishers that do the most translation from from English to French would be
Boreal.
Boreal and you.
Yeah.
More than
Well,
Yeah.
they're the ones that opened up really and had some major names. Flammarion Québec has opened up with Anne-Marie MacDonald. Fortunately,
Penny as
Margaret
well.
Atwood is published by Robert Laffont, and actually it is a shame because the translation we have comes from France, and there are a few things here and there and she doesn't really, I personally believe, shine as much as she should coming from France. But again, there are more and more Canadian being translated in Quebec, and some stories, like for example, the Sisters Brothers. We sold more copies of the Sisters Brothers in Quebec than in France, and to be perfectly honest, I just high-fived myself for hours and hours about that one. And it wasn't about numbers; it was about showing the world that we do have a very small market, but it's very active. It's made by and with wonderful people, wonderful authors. So we are not ashamed. We may be small, but Uzbekistan is small too. So I always said it doesn't matter where you come from. You bring your own country with yourself. But everybody can travel. So, and then again, I'm going to say thanks to Council for the Arts. So anyway, any more questions? For maybe one more.
Just
Yeah,
one.
sure.
When you find mistakes, which I'm sure you all do, mistakes in the original, how do you deal with that, and how do you go about correcting them?
That's a great question. I did find a couple of errors in the book I worked on. Errors that, for example, there's a character who takes drugs at one point, and it's referenced at one point earlier than it actually happened. They talk about her taking drugs, but she doesn't actually do it until the next chapter. I just simply dropped the reference for the first time. And I don't think I mentioned it because the book already came out. I didn't want to embarrass Geneviève. But there are a couple of things like that that do happen, obviously, and I worked around it.
That's one of the big advantages of working with living authors. If we find a mistake in a Mordecai Richler book, it's a little trickier, right? But we usually try and talk to the author about it. We don't pester authors night and day, but we usually have a few questions at the end. And once there was a book that was about, 350 pages long, and say on page 50 there was an oak bridge, and on page 212 it was a maple bridge. And that's a true example. And so we said this to the writer, and the writer said, how come my copy editors never saw that? How come you guys saw that? You want to copy edit my next book? and we've had that offer actually a number of times for many writers. But I think it shows something about what translation is too.
Right.
Because we've been talking about translation as writing, but translation is also about reading.
We're good readers.
We're very close, very patient readers, and we read many, many times. And I said earlier, you can't skip a word, you can't not care about that word or that little passage. So when we pointed that one out, then the author said, oh, well, let's just pick one. Let's have it be an oak bridge. And then we changed it. But if you were looking at only one passage in the translation, you'd say, oh, they translated oak by maple. That's pretty stupid. What's up with these translators? So if you correct too much, then it looks like you're making mistakes. So, and you don't want to have a disclaimer in the front saying any corrections were authorized by the author. It's a judgment call every time. But there are usually small things. The bigger the novel, the longer it takes, the more. They're usually tiny things, but you do see them. And some authors will just go, whoops, my bad, let's fix it. And others will try and explain to you why it wasn't really a mistake at all. But, the bridge looked like wood one day and another day it was actually metal or something. But it's an interesting thing because it's part of the process.
And that's happened with my book too, because at one point one of the characters says that sea monkeys and seahorses are related, and the Dutch translator wrote to me and said, well, they're not really. And I was going to say, well, the kid's only 13, maybe he's mistaken, but it was actually my mistake. So we ended up changing it in the Dutch version, and then I called them and said, change this. But in the English, it's still there.
I encountered a terrific error once. It was one of Michel Tremblay's books in which he, the little boy, is the central character. And he goes to school, he comes home for school at lunch, and in his voice he says that he is given by his mother his very favorite sandwiches. This is Friday afternoon, so he's very excited about getting out of the house. But she wants to hold him, and she does that by baiting his trap. She makes a ham and cheese. Remember that word? Sandwich for him. Stepping outside the dinner table. This is Quebec. It's Montreal in around 1954, 55. The Catholic Church is still very powerful, and you're getting it. It was Friday. They were Catholic. Mother makes kid a ham sandwich? I don't think so. But Michel told me that he had been brought up Catholic. The publisher had been brought up Catholic. There were a couple of other employees who were brought up Catholic. And it takes my Jewish publisher, translator, to spot it. It was a great moment.
And on this, it's Friday afternoon, after all. We're all going to have a cheese sandwich. Well, thanks, everyone. That's all the time we got. And maybe you can ask some question personally. But we have to wrap things up. Laurie Saint-Martin, Paul Gagné, Neil Smith, Sheila Fischman, thank you very much. Catherine Montgomery. And Barbara, back to you.
Just to say thank you to Antoine for conducting this fabulous conversation. Please do remember to fill out a comment card or go online and do our